G'day. Welcome to Australia Asks. This is part 3 of our discussion with Father Rod Bauer. Today we'll be discussing the Voice to Parliament and his views. So one of the things which is really topical in Australia at the moment is Voice to Parliament.
Yes.
So what's your view on the Voice to Parliament and the benefits that we potentially could get from it?
It's essential. Absolutely. And I'm so disappointed that some of our politicians are using this as an opportunity to score some other points. For me, this is a spiritual thing. To be honest, this voice is a spiritual thing. It's about being able to listen. It's about the whole of our nation saying to First Nations people, we value what you have to say. And we not only value, but we know we need to hear what you have to say, because we can't live here, we can't flourish here until we've heard what you have to say. Yeah. So this is, for me, it's not a political thing, it's a spiritual thing. And when we have heard that voice for long enough, and when we have understood that voice for long enough, we will flourish as a nation. And people who can't see that really frustrate me, and say it's things that it isn't. And this is a spiritual thing. It's about hearing the voice, hearing the songs, and learning to sing along.
I've heard some people in the community talk about voting against it because it's not enough. I see this maybe as a pathway. What other steps?
It's the Zeno principle, isn't it? You can never get to the other side of the room because you've got to get halfway first, and you can never get halfway because you've got to get halfway to halfway. And there's the problem about, we'll always sacrifice the possible for the perfect. It's not perfect. No, it's not as I'll agree with the Greens senator. It's not as good as a treaty, but we're not going to get a treaty at the moment. If we listen to the voice long enough, we might get a treaty. It's not the end of the journey. This is often the trouble with, you can hear my frustration there.
I can.
Often the trouble with our political life together is that we don't see it as a journey, and it is. And we can't get to the finish line before we start, and the voice is a way of starting. Yeah. It's not the end of the journey.
I think the apology was the start, and this is the next step in that journey.
I'll never forget the apology day. I gathered with a whole group of people at the Japanese Gardens at East Gosford, and there were some TVs set up in the pagoda there. Yeah. But everyone else standing sort of outside around this, and this huge storm came across Mount Penang, and it was just torrential rain. I've never seen rain like it. And there's a couple of hundred people. No one moved. We all just stood there, and it was like we were being washed clean.
We were talking about the restructure of the council here on the Central Coast. Is it maybe something we could take a leaf out of the Federal Parliament's book and try and have a voice within our council chambers? Have that local Indigenous voice so we can learn the songs, understand their history, so we can improve and grow.
There are a number of local governments who have actually entered into this process. Not only the voice process, there are a number of local governments that have entered into local treaties. And that's another part of that process, and maybe it has to happen at a local level first before we can do anything at a federal level. I was part of a process here nearly 20 years ago, where we were looking at this, the local landscape. The council did their consultation, and a landscape architect who was on Sydney City Council came up and engaged with some of the local land council people and local churches, and what we heard the local land council people say at the time is, in the CBD, we'd blocked up all the waterways There used to be a creek that sort of ran
down Man Street.
Ran down Man Street and then down Baker Street and then sort of out just down here. You can still see the remnants of it running out into Brisbane Water here. And the Indigenous people were saying, you've blocked up the water, and that's nothing can flourish without water. And we thought, well, you can't dig everything up, but you can we have a symbolic stream running down there through Kibble Park, and part of that is the idea of acknowledging what brings life to a community. And so, again, these are, at the time I heard this as a deeply spiritual thing, and what brings life?
Water.
What brings water? You can't have life without it. And so how do you, even if you can't physically restore the flow, how can you spiritually restore it to a place? I think these are extraordinarily important questions, and I'm hoping for incoming generations where we will see those. And I think that's, if we hear the voice, we will come to understand that they are just as important, if not more important, questions to grapple with than just some of the local planning issues that go through the process.
I think a lot of people are scared of what the voice will say, but I think, personally, I believe that they'll be surprised that it's the same as their voice. Regional Australia is actually quite in tune, many of us, with our country, our community. The communities, the villages we have here on the Central Coast are the same family groups that the Dukajung people had. The Carryong, the Narara, the Terrigal. These are the same villages that their family groups were already living in. So I think people will be surprised that the voice is the same. They're another voice of Australia, and it will empower us all, because particularly in the regions where we're in touch with our landscape, our country.
There are three questions we should have asked in 1788. The first question was, do you mind if we come ashore? Well, we didn't ask that question. The second question was, how do you live here? And from my perspective, the third question is, how do you pray here? A treaty in some ways belatedly asks that question, can we come ashore? The voice starts to address those next two questions. How do we live here? And how do we pray here? So what is the socio-economic question, and what is the spiritual question? And until we have the voice, we are not asking those next two questions in any way. They will help us hear the answers to those questions. And then I think, having heard the answers to those two questions, we can then genuinely revisit that first question. Do you mind if we come ashore?
So when I watched the meeting happen out in Alice Springs, the thing which I saw was a people which had been persecuted for 200 years opening their arms and asking for us to enter and us to participate. And I think it's our opportunity to step forward.
And what an extraordinarily spiritually mature thing to be able to do. After 230 years of genocide, theft, murder, cultural genocide, physical genocide, for a group of people to be still willing to engage generously, can't we see that there's a spiritual depth there that we want to engage with and learn from, and that will enable us to flourish in this place? I think you'd have to be willfully blind, willfully deaf not to see and hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for listening today. That was part 3 of our discussion with Father Rod Bauer. Please hit like and subscribe. Part 4 will be about the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse.